So this is the second half of the first part. Next week will be all like how we practically apply this to various things. So I'm going to start out with Dietrich von Hildebrand. Anybody know of him? Yeah. He actually was a big influence on John Paul II. His wife is still alive because he married her very young, Alice von Hildebrand. Of course, she's in her 90s. She was at Hudson University for a long time, I think, where he was a professor. So she was actually one of his students, and after his first wife, I think, had died, they hit it together. So they had there's two philosophers. And I did bring my wife to Alice von Hildebrand, talked about the heart and the will. And my good wife sat there, all you good wives that are with your husbands in a diaconate program, she would know what that is like. And then she didn't really want to talk about it after we left, though. I have a lot of questions now, but nonetheless. So Dietrich von Hildebrand. Now this is interesting. We'll talk more about this next week, but he says, look, why do male and female not have meaning? If they don't have meaning, then how can there be a uniqueness of our contribution? In other words, if two men can express the same understanding of love and conjugal love as a man and a woman, then that has to mean, just logically, there's nothing to do with Catholicism, that has to mean that there's no uniqueness to woman or male. They're interchangeable. You almost have to make that concession. So what John Paul II, I didn't really add this to your list of Imago Dei, but he does add male and female. We understand that maybe relationally, but he says we're made in his image, male and female. And there has to be some meaning to the uniqueness of what it means to be male and what it means to be female. We won't do it in this course where we lay out a list of some characteristics for each. Here's another aside. You don't need to worry about this. But in logic, there's two things called comprehension and extension. And almost all our problems that we have fall into one of these two things. The comprehension is like the inner attributes of a thing, right? So a male might have more upper body strength. And then somebody here is thinking, well, I know a male that's pretty weak. And I know a female that's pretty strong. Okay, you're talking about the extension. That's where all the entire population resides. But typically speaking, this is an attribute, right? So women typically are more empathetic, right? But we all know exceptions. So, we have to watch, saying that this particular person, that's where we get in trouble. You're a male, therefore you have more of a body strength. But we know generally speaking, that's true. But I noticed we're talking about mass shooting and everything that's going on. Listen to NPR coming down. And they were asking the question, why is it males? Isn't that interesting? Why they I don't have an answer. But there's something there, right? We might say testosterone. I'm sure that has something to do with it because hormones affect us, but that can't be the sum of it, right? But
there was an article, actually, it's just the New York Times, but there was an article on
sure.
why males who were doing shooting this weekend.
What did they say?
Basically, it was because they have lost their maleness.
Oh, I read that. I got that on my phone feed. In fact, I actually saved that because I thought, isn't that interesting? They're in other words, women have found a voice through the feminist movement, but the males still think that you have to be like this caveman.
Right.
Yeah, okay, I did read that.
But when I don't know, there's a friend of mine who sent me an article. She just told me to read about Josh Peterson. I think his name is Josh Peterson, and he does the differences. He talks about the differences between the inequalities between male and female, and he just had an interview on the BBC, and it was just a really fascinating thing to watch, basically, because she was very much a feminist and was going after him.
Oh, this is a woman?
Him. Yeah, a woman was attacking him.
Jordan Peterson? Is it?
Jordan Peterson,
yeah. He's a Canadian. Yes.
But it was interesting to watch, just interesting to watch the interview.
Well, it's interesting. I took a course with Dr. Rhonda Chervin. She's in Fordham with, you got her degree there. And it was a philosophical anthropology course, and we kind of came up with a list. And my list, she said that she identified all on the male side. but she did recognize that that's, it's somewhat true. I mean, so anyway, but there's a difference between extension and comprehension. We could talk about the attributes of a particular person without saying that that's extended to every single person within that population. And everybody always plays gotcha, right? Nonetheless. This is very important too. When we talk about conjugal love, this is a particular type of love. So again, could two women love each other deeply and profoundly? I don't imagine why you couldn't, nor do I imagine why you should. But when you start to think that conjugal love, right, this sexual type of expression of, gift and such, is just a product of love and sensuality, once you start thinking in that terms, then you don't understand, well, we're not talking about, there's no connection to unitive or procreative aspects of marriage. So if love and love expressed in marriage is based on mutual love and sensuality, then yeah, even in my mind, I'm going to have a hard time denying that to anybody. But that's not what we're talking about. So Dietrich von Hildebrand gives 4 things. Some may seem commonplace, but nonetheless. And this is all in terms of conjugal love. He says, first of all, it has to be an exchange of the total person. Right? It is not simply friendship with sensuality added to it. Okay? It's not just that. This is something on a different level. Something unique, something exclusive. He says, too, that this conjugal love has to have some aspect of consummation, right? And I like the way he puts this, and we've probably heard this, that it's a ratifying of our vows. So this is, it's a decision, right? It's not a possession. Love can never possess the other person. We have made a decision for this person, so all the vows, and we'll look at them real briefly, they all come to play in the conjugal act. And it's a renewing of that. This, too, is awe and reverence. At some point, you have to realize that we're participating in a creative act that goes beyond us. You and I that have children, I never say I'm the father of their body. Like my daughters, Nicole, Christy, Stephanie, I'm the person. But the person is an incarnate person of body and soul. I didn't supply the soul. I basically, but I'm the parent of the whole person. So at some point I have to realize, we say keep God out of the bedroom. How do you do that when you understand this to be supernaturally oriented and that I am participating in something that God has ordained as good? It has to cause us to stop and wonder sometimes. And I think people get this. When you see a newborn, it's hard not to look at this and say, I don't even know how this is possible, right? So there has to be an awe and reverence. And, excuse me, if I remember right, he says a lack of reverence, the symptom is boredom. In other words, when you start to lack reverence for the other spouse, you're going to fall, it almost becomes an indifference. And then you'll find yourself bored with that person, which gives you a little bit more of an inclination on what it means to have a discovery of the other person unfold in front of you. Again, it's not just finding out they like something different. I think I told you, we were married 9 years. Every time we had a birthday cake, my wife would send it home. Nobody here eats it. The whole time I'm like, I love cake. What are you doing? So, okay, so she learned something about me, but that wasn't it. I still like cake. We just had a birthday party. Now I have, between all my daughters and grandchildren, there's something going on all the time. But nonetheless, this is finding something else about them, right? So we're almost, again, this is mystery, right? We're involved in this. We're not in front of us. We're almost part of it. This is not like changing the oil in a car. This is not like building a cabinet. This is not like even doing surgery. This is a human person who's unfolding in front of us, and if we maintain a certain awe and reverence in that relationship, the benefit is we'll never fall into boredom. There's something always exciting around the corner. It's hard to articulate,
That should be the same as for a parent too. For the people who look at parents.
Oh, absolutely.
Your child is constantly.
Absolutely. Well, again, we won't do it in this course, but my view, again, Christ said, love each other as I've loved you. So this has to be something different. If we spend too much time equating conjugal sex with love, again, it's part of it, then we're going to miss something. The last thing he talks about is this principle of superabundance. We always think in terms of maybe monetary. I know we really don't, but we think in terms when I give something that I've lost something. We don't realize that this is almost like once we unite ourselves with Christ, we've united ourselves with infinity. So there's no end to this. So when we give something of ourselves, remember going back a few slides, this is how we find ourselves. Because we've repudiated ourselves as an end. And we've made God as the end that we both are working towards together. And this gift that we give, it's irrevocable. So even, if I remember right, he even says, conjugal, even in liturgy, he says liturgy should not be a means of self-transformation. Liturgy should be something in its own right, it has its own value. And it's to glorify God and sanctify man, which is the two ends of, liturgy. Well, those are the two ends, and then the two causes are it connects heaven and earth, and it connects all of us as individuals. So although, I made the remark once to a friend that, why don't we have as many, virtue stations as we do, fitness centers? And he says, well, I do think we have, that. We just call them churches. That would almost make it a utilitarian end. That's not for self-transformation, although it happens there, right? We always get caught that, yes, we are getting that there, but nonetheless. So John Paul II, this is really theology of the body proper. If you study this, you'll recognize some of this stuff. So in the beginning, when it was just man and the animals, and this was not male yet, right? If you read in the original, you have an understanding that all these animals are somehow other than you, and none of them you find fulfillment in, which is why after he named all the animals, God could see that he was alone. It's not good that man should be alone. But man knew himself. We are the animal that knows. So we knew that we weren't the orangutan, the giraffe, and all the others. And yet, because we were made in his image and we have a will, we too are self-determined. So do animals have free will? I don't know. We can get into all kinds of debates on consciousness, but we know that we're exceptional. I know that people today don't like to talk about humans being exceptional, that we're just one animal, but we are. It might be true that a chimpanzee shares 96% of our DNA, and it would take a geneticist to explain that to you, and a 5-year-old will tell you the difference. There are differences there, okay? And you really can't get around that when you're having a discussion with someone. When was the name a piece of music they've written? Name an artwork they've done. Do they know that they know? It's hard to say. Nonetheless. But he says we're in original solitude. He says, but then when male and female are made, there's an original unity. But you notice they're other, but they're still different than creation. They recognize that. And they realize they're built for communion and gift. Now, here's the problem. And this is what I always tell the engaged couples. When Adam was put, if you read it right in the Hebrew, it's like he was annihilated. And then from his side, Eve was drawn. And then Adam stands up and says, at last, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. There's no way he could have said it like that. This guy was alone in the world. He just went through, I don't know how many species there are, but there's more than 12. And he named them all. I had friends that, went to online dating and met people, and after 2 or 3, bummer dates, you're starting to kick yourself in the butt thinking, what kind of loser am I? Well, could you imagine if you cannot find something that's suitable for you after naming all the species, and then you literally are annihilated and then recreated, and then you see this? He's jumping up and down. He's jumping up and down. This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. They knew at that moment they were made for each other. This is communion and this is gift. All right? And they were also an original innocence. Again, sexists or not, women get this. Women know what it means, look me in the eye. Guy, no idea. Why would you look me in the eye? In their original innocence, there was absolutely no duplicity in their hearts. They'd have what we call an interior gaze. They can look at the other person without objectifying them. They can look at them, never going to use them as a means to an end, nor would they use them merely for pleasure. So there was no need to cover themselves. They were, that changes though, right? Original sin. Now, we know it's the loss of original holiness, and we know it's the loss of original justice. That's pretty much the definitions. Holiness really speaks to our relationship with God, right? That was damaged. And original justice is our relationship with all creation. That's how the Catechism spells it out. Now, we don't share this with other denominations per se, not even the Orthodox. They have a different understanding. A lot of this was, formulated with Augustine, so it came from the West. I'm sure your systematic courses, you guys will get into that or have gotten into it. Concupiscence, I know that if you were like me when you were young, you heard it said it was the tendency to sin. That's not a good way to say it. What happens is it's a disordering of our passions, and our passions and our desires get twisted. We no longer have, reason we become dysfunctional reasonably, so we no longer can get our passions and our desires in a proper order. So yes, it causes us to sin, but it's not really just a tendency to sin. It's like we have a difficulty doing the right thing. It's only this is obviously through grace is overcome, but nonetheless. And concupiscence, now that we understand what freedom is, this is a loss of interior freedom. Any questions?
What's the original?
Go ahead. What, Frank?
Original innocence.
Original innocence. Well, this was when they were naked and not afraid. So they stood with each other, and there was nothing to conceal because there was no duplicity in their gaze. We call it the interior gaze. They weren't looking at the other person as an object for pleasure or use. Now, this is just kind of interesting, and we don't know the science behind this. We don't even really know how to articulate it. But when we meet somebody else, we met our spouses, we meet people that we find attractive, or just people that somehow are loving, there's something else besides the physicality of that individual that we are attracted to. We don't know how to articulate it, but theologically we say we have understood that we've discovered some interior harmony. And sometimes that's the best we can do. Why is it that you'd find one person attractive? And again, there's nothing sinful in that, right? As long as you're not playing the real. If you teach kids that are young enough, all they want to know is, when does it become a sin? How many seconds? That kind of thing. It's a bad way to think about it. Very, didactic. But what is it that we're attracted to other people? And it's hard to say. All we know that there's something interior that we have sensed. Could it be just pheromones? I don't think it could just be that. I'm sure that's part of it. Again, we're incarnate beings, right? And the reality is there's a spontaneous attraction that we have to another that really doesn't appeal to like exterior traits. And it's hard to put our fingers on what's going on in these instances. This is a mystery, by the way. There's no problem there that could be identified, no protocol that could be put into place. So when we're in front of other people, and again, this isn't just sexual. It is that, but it's not just that. You know what it's like to be in front of a loving person. My wife, her hero was Mr. Rogers, and I got to admit, the guy does have a way to lower blood pressure when he walks into a room. You know, I think it's just, it was so sincere. You know, so, you know, what's the attraction? You know, it's not physical traits. There's something there that, you know, we can come across like that, and I don't know what that is. All we know is that we're being attracted to the good of the whole person.
I think part of it is in anticipation.
Could be.
You know, in terms of, you know, that's the mystery or what you're thinking. I mean,
Yeah. I bet. I'm sure there's a lot of psychological aspects to it. So, well, Tia says, okay, in a similar way, you know, like he's using an analogy then. That's where he was going with this. You know, with love as an affection of the will, you know, this is an expression of the whole person too. So there's an aspect of mystery. Again, there's no systematic protocol that's going to work through this. In the conjugal union, there's an interior harmony that somehow is being experienced. We just really can't put our finger on it. And I always think that if we can't say it, like, explicitly, we're in good space. That's a nice place to be. Which is why sometimes people say the experience is all you want to capture. You know, the photographs will never encapsulate the experience. And then think about all the things. Think of awe and wonder, superabundance, reverence, all these things that are coming to bear on this. Isn't it funny how a celibate priest know all that about human sexuality? Huh? So from Humane Vitae, 1968. It's conjugal love. It's a compound of sense and spirit. It cannot, and it is not, merely a question of natural instinct or emotional drive. Those things are part of it because we're incarnate beings. But it is not just that. We'll see next week. Some of this is a misread with people. I'm not going to make the case because I think it'll take too long, but I did in a paper once talk about how certain, not all, certain same-sex attractions could be really a misplaced friendship love that in our sexualized world doesn't know how else to express it. It's like, I love you so much, what do we do now? Well, what do people do that love each other? Well, there's sexual intimacy. No, see, that was the problem right there. You were into something very profound, you know. So anyway. So we know that the body alone can make what's invisible visible. And we know when there's something that's contradictory. If I sat up here and said, I'm so happy tonight, I think I've never been this excited in my whole life, you know there's a disconnect between what's going on, right? And we also know that if we are feeling down, you know, sometimes, you know, laughter and stuff, you know, why? Why is that? Are we fooling ourselves into that emotion? No, we're incarnate beings. So we get the connection between these things. But we're trying to make things more visible than simple emotions. We have to make love visible. So the body is a sign. Now, if you need to know it, the definition of a sign is it represents something other than itself to a knowing power, right? So a stop sign will have meaning to me and you. If you put it out in the middle of a desert, a camel's not going to just wait until something changes, right? And you don't need to know it for this course, but there are conventional signs, signs that we give it meaning, and there are natural signs where the meaning's already built in. Guess which the sacraments are? Natural. Nobody has to tell you that bread has to do with sustenance, that alcohol has to do with joy, that, you know, what else? That water cleanses, it sustains, and water also destroys. Those are natural signs. So if we want to explain in baptism why do we use water, it should be apparent to anybody in the world. And the same thing with wine and bread and such, okay? But those are natural signs. Well, the body, too, is a natural sign, okay? So we're not one of the sacramental rites, but this becomes sacramental. But if you don't think that, if you don't think your body's a sign, you're never going to look at it as a way to communicate something. And because so many marriages do not reflect this ideal, doesn't really change any of this. That's always the argument, right? Well, why not let anybody get married? Because look how many marriages end in divorce. Okay, well, let's apply that logic to something else. So many people lie, so I don't think it's worth telling the truth. It's just terrible logic. We should be more honest with ourselves and just say, you know, look, I'm just throwing stuff against the wall. So this is, I should have called it an ideal, because it's not just an ideal.
Question?
Sure.
Well, it's not really a question, it's more of a comment. This just made me think. There was an article I read, it was a scientific article, something related to how, or when people meet somebody, they tend to pick people who are genetically different from themselves. However, if a woman is on birth control, using birth control, women tend to pick another person who is genetically similar to her. But apparently they're saying that when, at a later time, when the woman decides that she wants to stop using birth control, because she wants to get pregnant, and then she'll look at the person and say, who are you? They look at each other and go, who are you? You know, I thought that was interesting. It was something, when I read it, I thought, oh, that's, you know, the church maybe knew something before anybody figured this out, you know? That's a scientific kind of, it was a scientific study.
Keep that thought for dialectic, Billy. It's true. I have the article. If you want, I could share it with you. There's, and you know, we'll talk about contraception and how it works, but it maybe it's colloquial to say it makes the woman appear as though she's in a pregnant state. So when they studied this with like primates, and they put certain orangutans on Depo-Provera, the male would stay away because he sensed that those women were pregnant. And I think they had like 9 females, and as they put the next 3 on, then he stayed away from the 6. When they put all 9 on, he started to act in a weird way, even with other males. And as they took him off, he went right back to the original 3 that he was with. So there's something there. They've also done it. Did you read, Billy, the one with the T-shirts and the hormones? That might have been the one that you're talking about. They had, they had girls pick out guys they'd wear their T-shirts and sweat on them, and then the girls that were on birth control or not, they were actually picking people who were, and by genetic they were saying these are the, what do they call it? I don't remember what the inhibitor it is. It had something to do with boosting the immune system. So they were picking people that were similar, and the women who were not on contraception were picking just through the sweat on the shirts, people who were genetically varied from them. So I think you're right. It's going to be 70 years before you can talk about this on a good level, because everything's too hot. The minute you start bringing that up, you're not going to have a good conversation with it. I've tried. Okay, so we're told, and this isn't from Donum Vitae, that there has to be the spousal and parental meanings to the conjugal act. So obviously we're talking about the unitive and procreative dimensions. We're talking about becoming one. And there has to be the end of the sexual act. And I don't want to shock anybody. I'm not being crass. I don't use children language, right? The result of an orgasm has one function, the giving of life. There's really no other purpose for that, biologically. So all we're going to come in and say is, if we know the design of that, there has to be a reason for that act. That has very little, I mean, obviously we believe that theologically, but we're also showing it to you here just in terms of there's an end, an end or a goal that comes from that. Obviously these things have been severed, right? We've severed sex from love and sex from procreation. So we're in a generation now. What are we? 1960, 40, what are we, 68 years, where, 68 years now where getting pregnant because you've had sex hasn't been a given. So we have a different, I don't know how you want to say it, we have a different fight that's in force. Now there's plenty else that I had here that I didn't put up on the screen for you. But he talks about, in this conjugal love in the body, he talks about how we're poor lovers. I mean, we never do it well. We never really know how to love in a good and beautiful way. So that's part of our dilemma. So in our marriages, we're never free from difficulties. The reason why we have and if you know anything about Aristotelian causes, this is an aside, you don't need to know this for the course, but there's 4 causes. One is the material cause, what is it made of? One is the formal cause, what's my idea? One is the efficient cause, who's doing it? And one is the final cause, what's it going to happen? So if I had a block of marble, that's the material cause. If I'm thinking of the statue of David I'm going to carve, that's the formal cause. If I'm actually doing it, I'm the efficient cause. And I'm going to put this on a pedestal in my big living room when I'm done, that's the final cause. So we have today, most science just deals with the efficient cause. They don't really look at the final cause. But we talk in terms of formal and material. So if the material cause is this conjugal love, the formal cause is the marriage. It needs something else there to encapsulate it. It needs something to protect it. It should be the safe place for a couple. It should be the safe place, which is why the vows are so important, especially until death do we part. That should be a consolation for the individual. So all these struggles that we go through in our marriages, we're so quick, right, to conquer another person, and we're so slow to conquer ourselves. So if we realize and fall back on our vows, we realize we will work this out. We don't want to lose hope, which is why hope is such an important virtue in marriage. And I will at least tell you in the future, there's 2 sins against hope. One is despair, and the other one's presumption. They just, hit both ends. So we have to realize that, this is not, if we're looking for a good marriage and we equate a good marriage where it's trouble-free, we're doomed. That's not what it should be. It's not even being cynical and saying that's what it is. It should not be that, all right? Why? Because we are imaging something that's God's love for the church. He's always faithful. But remember, we've blown every single covenant that we've gotten into with him. But he's steadfast. Okay, our marriages are imaging that. And you remember in the old scriptures with Isaiah, didn't God say, go and take a whore as a wife? Because that's our relationship. I'm faithful and you're not. Right? So I might be wrong on that. So Karawati in his book Love and Responsibility talks about how do we interpret this urge. Well, sexually, urge, it seems like it's something that comes like just from instinct. And we have this sense in our head that somehow there's something bad about it too, but it's instinctual. So he says we always feel like it's in conflict with our freedom if we don't understand freedom properly, right? We feel like somehow to depress this urge is a lack of freedom, right? We're in the freedom of indifference there. The Catholic Church has a high regard for the human person. I don't think you can say this enough. And I say to people who are absolutely cynical, and I say, who else tells you that you can rise above your instincts, that you do not have to give in? Born this way, how about if you act the way that you are called to act? Do that which you were designed to do. We have a higher regard for you. We don't think that you are just instinctual. And by the way, this is how we are in dominion over the world.
Sometimes I think what happened though is people feel guilty because they have this thing.
Yes.
Or an urge.
That's part of it too.
It's kind of reinforced.
Yep.
This kind of,
Yeah, the old guilt thing. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So this urge that we have is quite natural. Remember, when we get into natural law in a few weeks, I'll talk to you about our natural inclinations, and one of them is to procreate. Well, the reality is that biological? Well, sure. Is it merely biological? No. There's something else there. If it were just biological, like if I were an atheistic materialist, then I would, why not be like, what's the guy from Playboy that passed away? Hugh Hefner. Why not be like that? I mean, if there really is nothing beyond this, and what amounts to enjoyment is pleasure for you, and as long as the other person is having pleasure, that sense of mutual altruism, and sex is just a means to have pleasure, well, then why not use it in any way that you would? The reason why this doesn't work, even in the world, is that nobody would do this with food. If somebody only ate food because it gave them pleasure, we would identify that as a disorder. And if somebody said, well, why? You're saying I shouldn't have pleasure eating food? No, I know you should have pleasure eating food. You said you're only eating food for pleasure. That's a disorder. Now, why don't we think that way in terms of human sexuality? Well, because of our understandings of freedom, right? We think that somehow this is an imposition on us. So we recognize it's biological because the sexual urge occurs within the body. This is part of what the body's communicating. But we're calling it super-personal. It goes above us as individuals. So the personalistic norm, again, that we are made, for love, that is the only response to the value of the human person. It places this urge in the context of two persons and love. So marriage then, and in the marriage covenant and within the vows, that then sets protections and parameters that the other person will not be used as a means to an end or simply as enjoyment. It gives it a place to thrive, but a place to thrive to do that which it was designed to do in absolute freedom. I mean, it's wonderful news. It's just, how do you communicate this? It's not easy. John Paul II is not always the easiest person to understand, and it has a lot to do with Eastern Europeans and how they write. I had a class with theology of the body. I think there was 2 other lay people, 2 or 3 religious sisters or brothers, and 23 seminarians. And when we were asked at the end, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to, putting this out in the parishes, it was almost like we rehearsed it. Everybody said the sheer depth of it. So what happens is, when you bring this down a little bit, you can give people a taste for it, but they're really not grabbing at all. I mean, this stuff, it could be dense. John Paul II was probably one of the best philosophers to sit on that chair in the last 400 years. We just don't know that because we had him. But I think that's what will be said of him in 500 years from now. Unless the rapture happens, then hope somebody takes care of my dog. That's a joke. So the role of pleasure cannot usurp the personalistic norm of the other person. It just can't.
Can you explain that?
Yeah. We have to understand that this urge that we have should be pleasurable. That it's not just merely biological, but it is also biological. But that it has to be exercised, that instinct has to be exercised in what we would say are exercising of self-dominion. All right? So, the personalistic norm that we were made for love of and in relationship with the other person, that really takes the urge. And as long as it connects between 2 persons in love, it almost saves it. And all we're doing here is reiterating. You can't let pleasure take a foothold and let that become the drive. Because if that becomes the drive, then we're going to go back to, once we start saying that the minute I am not receiving pleasure, I'm going to start becoming indifferent to the other person's pleasure, and then I'm going to escalate either, something more deviant, or I'm going to look elsewhere. This is what marriage is supposed to do. It should be like a safe haven for 2 people that want to express their vocation. Let's see how much we got here. I think you're going to like this. This is an interesting take he has on it. Our understanding of shame is it hides what's bad. I mean, we may not define it that way, but we kind of have that feeling. Because when we do something bad, we're ashamed. Right? John Paul II says, that aside, maybe if a kid gets caught with cookies or something and he shouldn't have had it and he's embarrassed, fine. But he says, in our terms of the body and sexuality, shame really arises when something that was meant to be private has entered the public sphere. Okay, so this is why we see the first couple who clothe themselves, and then even God recognizes that they are now objectifying each other, and he fashions aprons for them. It's almost like he concedes this is now going to be the struggle between you two. So that interior gaze is gone. Now it's so difficult, even within marriage, for one spouse to not objectify the other. It takes quite a bit. So he says that's what we're talking about when we talk about shame. The problem, though, with shame and modesty is people think you have to dress like some Amish, to ward things off. And I don't know if there's anything necessarily wrong with that. Maybe they've got it better. I don't really know. But the reality is we don't just identify shame with clothing. That would be a mistake. He says that's absolutely, it's secondary. There's something that's deeper that's going on there. That being said, you want to talk about the difference between male and female. Women are, I think men are much more visually stimulated. I think that bears out in a lot of the evidence. So a man's going to react differently in terms of modesty than a woman may or may not. I won't go too far in that so I don't get myself in trouble. So what modesty then is for an individual is you're not hiding something that's bad, right? You don't say, girls, button your shirt up, guys, pull your pants up, whatever. That one, I don't mean to sound like an old fart. I don't get that whatsoever. It's the same thing that Adam and Eve, when they fashioned the fig leaves for themselves, and then God gave them the aprons, they were protecting themselves from objectification by the other person, being used. So modesty is really a self-defense against that. Now, somebody might say, I don't mind. They've said it to me. I like looking sexy. I like when guys look at me. Okay, remember, you can't even give that up, that norm. You can't just forfeit that. You can't forfeit it, nor is it transferable. You can't do that. So it's not a matter of simply being, complicit. So men and women and children, we're going to have different views on this, right? Children, it's nothing. I mean, because, prepubescent young girls and boys, whether they're going around with their shirts on or not, there's not a sexual component there. I mean, I'm sure there's some deviants that think so, but generally speaking, there's no shame there. They're not concealing anything. And to be quite honest, I think it's a shame that they make these little bikinis for, 6-year-olds. It's like, just let them go swimming. Nobody's even thinking anything. Why are you even putting that in their head that they have to dress like that? And women, I think, because man is more visually stimulated and a woman is more tactile, I think there has to be a little bit more of defense on their part in terms of protecting themselves from self-objectification. And I guess, the argument is, well, you shouldn't look. Well, sometimes you can't help yourselves. I mean, it's, my wife will notice some things before I do, and you're like, oh, geez, So then what happens with love and shame? This is kind of the beautiful part. Shame loses its whole reasons for existence in marriage and in love. So what shame holds as private, now in the union of two people, it develops as a shared value. You don't need to conceal yourself. You're safe with me. That's what we should be saying to each other in marriage. It's not necessarily eliminated. It's not necessarily destroyed. But it's absorbed. Or it should be. And again, it doesn't matter if there are many marriages where this doesn't occur. That doesn't dismiss this, right? And living together doesn't do this. I'm going to show you some definitions of marriage you may have never heard next week. There's a reason why it's laid out the way that it is. Nothing of what we're talking about here is prudeness, right? John Paul II says, prudeness is when you conceal your real intentions, usually having to do with sexuality. So, and I know this is so stereotypical, but it's obvious. You know, some minister on TV with a bolo tie saying, I never in a million years would look at another woman, I wouldn't find anybody but my wife attractive. Okay, you're a prude. You're not even being honest. You're concealing true intentions. You know, instead, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to reach a personalistic norm with that person. And we're going to recognize that their modesty in my presence is not a hiding of something that's bad. It's simply protecting them from objectification. It's helping me love them. And, you know, anybody that's around high school kids, you know the struggle here. Good luck. You know, they roll the skirts up, they unbutton the shirts. It's an endless fight. So what immodesty does is it contributes to the deliberate displacement of the personal value that we each hold. And it does that just to elicit a reaction. Right? So we've gone, remember, if you remember way back earlier in the course, I said the counterfeit of beauty is titillation. So it's hard to find another person beautiful. Yet titillation is that, you know, instantaneous gratification. So we are looking at some sort of sexual enjoyment of the person over a personal value that they truly have. And it's a struggle here. I mean, obviously I'm not putting the onus on women, but if you're having a conversation in the public square and you try to speak about this, you can see where it might go in terms of rape, or you're saying it's their fault. No, not whatsoever. You know. But we have to realize that there are certain ways that we carry ourselves, and it's not just clothes. That's the point he was trying to make. I heard one priest, and I can't remember what his name was, he said there are probably some women who can walk naked in absolute, you know, I don't know how he said it, in absolute modesty. Another woman who could be fully clothed who are immodest, right? Obviously he's making a point, but the point is probably valid. There are other ways that we carry ourselves. So it's not just the clothes. That's secondary. But we're not trying to be prudes. We're not concealing real intentions. We're not covering something that's bad. What we are saying is that in marriage, what was necessary before that kept something that's private from going public, now there's no need for that. Marriage now absorbs that. And you know, I mean, I've had daughters, and I remember telling them, fortunately they're old, they're never really into Facebook and stuff, but I kept saying, don't take pictures of yourself at the beach or something and put your picture up there in a bikini. I said, would you take a picture of yourself, go make 50 copies and hand it out to random people? No. Well, then why would you give it to millions? I mean, we don't, but nobody thinks like that, you know, especially when you're young. Most of us ought to be glad the internet wasn't around when we were kids. I won't be teaching. Okay. Now, you guys, this is not a treatise on vocations. Just a little tidbit. I'm sure you've had much more than this. So there are those primary vocations in life: marriage, priesthood, consecrated life, ministerial, diaconate now, right? They're exclusive and enduring. And these are signs, right? These are signs that are holding these. Secondary vocation, you know, I'm just adding these because, you know, we often, just as lay people, we don't grab on to the dignities that we have. You know, I'm a king. I'm been baptized. That means, you know, I share dignity with the royal person. I'm a prophet. I can speak the truth. I am a priest. I can offer sacrifices. I can unite them at the hands of the priest with Christ. That's by virtue of my baptism. Could you imagine if we just grabbed hold of that? and that dignity. Because I have nothing against clerics, but the lay people is where this hope's going to be. I mean, this is the army, right? I mean, so we need to really boost this up. And the universal call to holiness, that, again, one of the great things that come out of Vatican II. It does not matter what type of hat you have or don't have. Same level of holiness. Same level of holiness. I say this too because I guess, I don't know, did you guys get into any discussions on to is single life a vocation? Not yet. Okay, you know, where do you go with this? I mean, first of all, why is the person, first of all, singlehood is not typically a permanent state. So if you're a consecrated virgin, that's okay. I mean, beyond a religious, I have my friend, Dr. Rhonda Cherubin, she's a consecrated virgin. That's something that's in line with the bishop. But that's permanent. You know, singlehood is not. Well, then what vocation does a singlehood have? You have your baptism, your universal call to holiness. Let's not have clericalism going on here and thinking there's something better. You're called to the same level. There's no sacramental aspects to enshrine it. So if somebody does say there's a call to singlehood, we don't have any liturgical rites that have enshrined it. That tells us something. I think the problem is that if we start to put too much emphasis on a particular, you know, difference in vocation that's connected to holiness, that's where the problem comes. Friends I have that are Orthodox, you don't see it as much. I don't know if it has something to do with the clergy's married and such, they're all out, but if I'm having a discussion with my one priest friend, he'd find it a little odd. He's a Greek Orthodox. He gets it, he understands it, but he says, well, you guys just figured out what we always knew. Well, we always knew that too. It's just that as you have learned in the history of morality, things get emphasized differently, right? So Christian revelation presents two vocations to love, marriage and virginity. Some societies, not only marriage and virginity, but also the priesthood and religious life, they're in a state of crisis. My view, it's marriage is in a state of crisis. You know, I'm a big proponent when people pray for vocations, let's start with marriage. Because too often, and I'm not talking about any diocese, I don't live in this diocese, you know, people say we're trying to increase vocations, they mean one thing, priest. You know, I was at a baptism up in Danville, and the priest prayed for vocations, and he said, I pray first and foremost for marriage. After the Mass, I went and said something to him, and he said, well, that's the one that's in crisis. So anyway, but they're all inseparable, right? We love splitting things up, right? That's the old joke. There's only two kinds of people in the world, the person that puts people into groups of two and the ones that don't. Did you get that? Where marriage is not esteemed, consecrated virginity or celibacy really can't exist. You know, when human sexuality is not regarded as a great value, then what's the value in renunciating it? You know, I mean, these things are inseparable. It's all for the kingdom of God. And if we don't keep it in the context of the kingdom of God, it all loses its meaning. And it just seems, again, like arbitrary rules. I think that's the Pontifical Council of the Family, the truth and meaning of human sexuality. You know, celibacy, especially with young people, you know, their idea of celibacy is I can't have sex, which then makes marriage some default. The book that I've been wanting to write, I'll have to wait a few years, is, you know, marriage not by default. You know, could we not get young people, like 3rd, 4th grade, what's your vocation? Not, do you have a vocation? We know you have a vocation. What is it? Is it marriage? Are you called to marriage? Because if you're not called to marriage, which I tell the engaged couples every time I'm in front of them, just get out now. I know you're engaged. I know you spent money on the wedding, but now's the time to do it. No harm, no foul, get out. I said, because if you're not called to it, it's going to be misery. Could you imagine going into a vocation you're not called to? People do miss their vocations, and that can go either way. But celibacy, the way that the people that I know that celebrate it, you know, they'll talk about it in terms of a holy longing. You know, now, so because in the Western Church we're celibate, theology of the body will often put it in the frame of it's pointing towards a future consummation. It's holding out now for what's available in the future. And marriage is showing us now what we will have then. Celibacy is holding out for that. So that's how it's put in theology of the body. You know, it's going to be a little more difficult with some priests who are married, and some priests are. I don't know if you know any. But it's not an escape, right? You don't go into this vocation because for some reason you don't want to be married or you want to get away from the world. You know, Sister Act. It's not a place to hide from the mob. So theology of the body says earthly continence. It tells us that the body's end is not the grave. There's something else there. There's a future glorification. So continence for the kingdom of heaven is a witness among men that anticipates a future resurrection. And I think it could have that sign.
Can you explain that?
Yeah.
What is
So,
earthly continence?
well, continence would be like controls over your habits and such. So the fact that you can control your desires and such, and using your body to do that, remember your body's a sign, then what that's telling us, you're being a sign that says, there is something after this world. Why would I renounce something so beautiful if I wasn't holding out for something at the end? So I'm not holding out because it's bad. I'm not running away from the world. I'm not running away from marriage. I just want to stand there as a sign that says there's something at the other side. Marriage will be the sign here now of what that glory looks like. Here's the glimpse. The celibate says, I'll hold out till the end. And if, you know, reading theology of the body is a little difficult. Not that I think it's that necessarily deep, but he wrote it prior to becoming pontiff, but then he published it while he was a pontiff in, if you know, by giving Wednesday catechesis. So every Wednesday for 15 minutes, except for parts of Lent, he would, you know, give you this. So it's so redundant. It usually follows, last week I said this, you know, next, or tomorrow I will say this, that type of thing. So you feel like you're reading a lot, and it's all broken down into days. And he did it over the course of 4 years. And he called it marriage, love, and the divine plan. He never called it theology of the body. I don't really know where that came from. But that's how it's marketed. It's a cottage industry. So he says, marriage, it's the mutual sanctification of the other person. And all of the turmoils and all of the joys, right? All the aids, the comforts, the consolations, all of those things. So it's a blending of all those things and a mutual interchange and a sharing thereof. And think of these vows in terms of the conjugal act. And then I think this is it. Is this the last slide?
Yeah.
This is-
So I promise to be true. Now, first of all, we don't live in a world where we think words have power to transform. Let's not forget that we have a God who spoke words and things were brought into being. So we don't get sometimes the depth of what our words mean, so we're cheap with them. So when we tell somebody, I'll promise to be true, we have the authentic ability to transform each other. In a sense that this is mutual sanctification. Which, you know, the church is really, you've seen a migration for so long, you know, the purpose of marriage was children. I mean, that was, then you saw it started, well, we'll talk about love being tied to that. So then we see the two ends, which is kind of like in the last 150 years or so. But this understanding of mutual sanctification, you know, is really coming more to the fore. And a lot of this is development and emphasis, so I'm not trying to say that there's been change, but there has been development in it. So anyway, he says here, and this is Pius X, well, at least on my paper, Pius XII, I'm sorry, his allocution to midwives. He said, there's a general way to let the couple know that there are better times ahead. Some would like to maintain that happiness in married life is a direct ratio to the mutual enjoyment of your marital relations. So you're happy as long as you're enjoying it. He goes, that's not so. Happiness in married life is in direct ratio to the respect that the husband and wife have for each other. So happiness comes from respect, not from enjoying. And he goes, and that includes the intimate act. So they regard what nature offers them and that God has given them as immoral, and they refuse it. But because the respect and mutual esteem arise from it, one of the strongest elements of love, which is all the pure because it's more tender. So the fact that, again, I think the higher you go up on some scale, the more tendency there is that you can abuse it. You're probably getting closer to the truth of something. So love can be as a weapon used against other people because you're in a mystery here. This isn't a lower thing. So we get into more sublime areas of our life, I think they could be misused. In good times and bad, we don't need to go all about that. We know that the bad times are a certainty. But if we think that somehow our marriage is only the connection of all the good times, we've missed the understanding of love, gift, and sacrifice. In sickness and health, I think I've already shared with you that the reality is if you are taking care of somebody who has a terminal or a chronic illness, think in terms of God saying, I trust you enough to let you take care of this person. And that whatever sacrifice you are giving is not a detriment to you. It's actually you are finding yourself and giving yourself to this person because you're losing yourself. You are repudiating yourself as an end. If we only thought about that in marriage, just do it well. If you can make it 50 years, just do it well. I mean, if we really believed that there was a supernatural life after this, we would probably almost bow in front of our spouses, and if our bosses gave us a raise, we'd probably turn it down out of fear. I mean, in the same way that we would push away a cigarette because we don't want cancer. When God says, and remember you read in the one article last week, that, riches are actually an obstacle to eternal life. If we really believe that, we would shed it. But I think we're weak. We're poor lovers. And for richer or poorer, some people never get out of one or the other. So, but nonetheless, it's not until death do we part, right? And again, because money, they say, is the number one reason for divorce, it's kind of a sickness, I think. I mean, how cheap are our vows that we're willing to trade them off for money? And until death do we part, this is the irrevocable aspect of marriage. It's supposed to be the comfort that we all bring to it. And remember I shared with you that people who have had affairs on them, I always thought, what if somebody did that to me? I would be pissed. I would feel like a jerk. I would feel like, did everybody else know? I now ruined, 25 years, 30 years of my life. I'd be going down the gauntlet. But people report saying, I thought you chose me, which really makes you think that maybe it's not just in the conjugal act that we renew our vows, but why are we not, reiterating these to each other on a regular basis? At least that part, saying, I choose you. Because, in other words, you've given up something for me. Shame has been absorbed into our love. This is now the safe place for us to express this with any fear of duplicity. We don't have to try to hide behind our fig leaves for objectification. And the way that I will confirm that into you is you never have to worry until I die. That should be absolute comfort. Now, we'll see how marriages are going. There's variations. One variation, I call it the term limit. You'll see next week. I actually found there's a name for them. These are presidential marriages. You get married for 4 years. I'm not making this up. And you could up it for another 4. But then that's it. I think the terms are too long for politicians. Forget about the marriage.
Do you present a lot of this to your marriage prep?
No, not this stuff,
I was
no.
just wondering, yeah.
No, I try to keep things more anecdotal for them. What I do is I start them out by giving them those 2 different mythos, the Enuma Elish and the priestly mythos from the Hebrew Bible, and then I explain the differences on why our story's better. And then I do explain to them about the Imago Dei. And I show them a video that I just found on YouTube. It's really a nice video because I want them to work backwards, right? where this young couple who's engaged, they're in their 20s, they sit down for a staging where they get makeup and they are aged prosthetically. Have you seen it?
Yeah.
It's really something. So they look at each other, when they're in their 40s, and they're like, oh my God, you look just like my mom, that kind of thing. And, and the guy's like, I still think I look pretty good here, that kind of thing. And then they age them to like 70, and then they age them to 90. What you see once they get up to like the 70 and the 90, now this is just a staged event. They start crying. And when the person who's filming him says, why are you so emotional? And he says, I just can't imagine all the things we shared. And I can't imagine what life would be like without you. And then the guy says, I don't think, and he's almost talking like in the present tense, I don't think I could be who I was without you. I mean, it's almost like this shared thing. So then, I obviously tell the engaged couples, why is this not in our grasp? If we have, usually it's about 50 couples. I do it at Alvernia University. So, 50 people. I used to do 50 couples. They brought it down to 50 people. We should never lose hope, but neither should we be so naive to think that 25 couples are all going to be married in 15 years. So I asked them, so who will it be? I've never met anybody that thought it's going to be me. Could it be everybody? Yeah, wouldn't that be a revolution? Why won't it be? Because we don't choose well. We typically choose lesser goods. I don't talk in terms like this, but it's the same stuff, right? So it'd be nice to see it different. So here I say how the family gets no catechesis, and I give you one line. You did read the article, though, hopefully. So the family itself constitutes a specific revelation and an ecclesial communion. So we are the domestic church as families. We just have to figure out what that means, right? And it's really based on the dignity of our baptism, that we are made, priest, prophet, and king. I have a friend, I wish I would have done this with my kids when they were little. We did a sleepover outside. I think I mentioned it before, but it was a homeless awareness night. And I think he had 4 or 5 kids. And I saw before each of them went to bed, he was blessing them. Now I have a friend who's a deacon who said, well, I don't think he should be blessing people. I said, why not? He's a priest. He's not out there pretending he's a priest, a clerical priest. Is he not the father of those children? Why should he not be blessing them? What a beautiful ritual, We've tried in our family I used to light a candle every time we'd eat. And why am I lighting a candle? I say it, because we are made in his dignity, that we are special people. And this is an event, not just eating, but the fact that we are here together as a family. And we develop our particular prayer that we say before every meal that I hope they carry with you. But there's nothing perfect here. You do your best. But if we lived a radical way, even some of the stuff from here tonight, we would transform parishes. We get so worried about if the Pope said this or if that bishop said this, and why are we not simply just putting it out what we need to do? It's not that hard. It's difficult for us to do because remember concupiscence. There's always this disordering between our desires and our intellect, and we can't get these things lined up. So, any questions?
Comment.